Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. And I'm going to go in a slightly different direction today. A lot of the stuff I've focused on in the last few months has been about the big things of revolution and war, and the weighty stuff, a lot of economic history. And today I'm going to focus on Billie Holiday. Billie Holiday, particularly in 1939, and the creation of the song which came to define her, Strange Fruit. Now, I'm working today from Dorian Lynskey's book, 33 Revolutions Per Minute, which is a kind of a very interesting cultural history of protest music. And his argument is that Strange Fruit was the beginnings of protest music itself. It's the first genuinely popular song which can be said to have been have a protest encoded within it. Of course, folk music has a very politicised vein running through it, and has done since perhaps back to the Middle Ages. The blues was again another means of articulating the suffering of slavery and discrimination and segregation amongst black Americans. So it's not to say that there hasn't been a vein of protest within music, but in the 20th century, protest and popular song, and the mediums by which popular song is disseminated, recording, broadcasting, that kind of thing, coincide to create this very interesting and complex genre. The song was first sung by Billie Holiday in 1939, just on the eve of the Second World War, in March of that year. And it was performed at Cafe Society on West 4th Street in New York, which was famously referred to as the wrong place for the right people. Cafe Society was a very bohemian establishment which was all about rejecting the elitism of many of the social clubs of New York. And it was a club where black patrons were allowed, but also had some of the most privileged places within the audience. Billie Holiday herself obviously came from Harlem, the cultural centre of black life, not just in New York, but perhaps in all of America. She had made her initial performances there as a singer with Count Basie's band, and she was really part of what became known as the Harlem Renaissance. If you've ever heard me mention Mark Nyson's book, Black Communists in Harlem During the Great Depression, that paints a very interesting picture of the situation in Harlem, and the crossover between art and politics, which always exists in these sorts of hotbeds of kind of culture and thought. The song Strange Fruit wasn't written by Billie Holiday. It was written by a Jewish communist activist called Abel Meeropol. The song was not written initially with Billie Holiday in mind. It wasn't even written with a popular mainstream audience in mind. It had an explicitly political message, and a lot of the time the music that was written by people like Meeropol wasn't written to be played in nightclubs, but at picket lines and at meetings of trade unions and left-wing parties. But it would be the meeting of Meeropol and Billie Holiday that turned the song into something else. The first protest song to deal with the question of race was the 1929 song Black and Blue, which was originally written by Andy Razaf and Fats Waller, which was included in the musical Hot Chocolates and sung by Edith Wilson. When it was first sung, Black and Blue reached out to an audience who had grown up hearing black music as minstrelling, the music tradition that really parodied black lives instead of reflecting them, where black entertainers and white entertainers wearing blackface created these sort of parodies of the Jim Crow character and the supplicating and ignorant Negro. And the whole reason for the minstrel tradition was designed to kind of culturally disempower black people, just as they had been disempowered after the end of the Reconstruction era, politically and economically. But the song Black and Blue had a decided political message. Has one couplet in it: "I'm white inside, it don't help my case, 'cause I can't hide what is on my face." Some writers on black music have suggested that it was Black and Blue that radicalised black music in America thereafter. It gave black entertainers and black performers more of a right to be explicit about racial oppression. In 1936, Lawrence Gellert, a socialist researcher, toured the South and collected a compendium of 200 songs called the Negro Songs of Protest. And these were songs by black bluesmen and musicians who had never been allowed to set foot in a recording studio, and yet had their own way of articulating the suffering that they had endured and witnessed throughout their lives. But the first major recording artist who was able to articulate the suffering of black Americans in the South was the former Louisiana convict, Billie, who composed a song in 1938 called Bourgeois Blues, which was about racial discrimination not in the South, but actually racial discrimination that he encountered on a trip to Washington, D.C. Abel Meeropol was reflective enough to see that his experience of life, even as an outsider, a Jewish communist in largely kind of waspish society, was in no way equivalent in terms of suffering to the fate of black people in the South, and he was aware that only really a black person from the southern states would be able to fully comprehend the experience they had gone through. However, he knew that it was more than possible to write a song about the horrors of lynching, which is ultimately what Strange Fruit is about. The practice of lynching was starting to go into gradual decline at the end of the 1930s, but it was a photograph of a double hanging which really affected Meeropol and horrified him to the extent that he became inspired to write a song. The lynching had taken place in Indiana in 1930, but it became really the pin-up image for American racism, and it was also a metaphor for all the other kinds of bigotry and racism that affected black American people. And the conviction that Meeropol had in writing Strange Fruit, which was a song which had never been the kind of song which had never really been attempted before, came from this image. He wrote a poem in 1937 called Bitter Fruit, and it was published in a trade union-run magazine, the New York Teacher, in 1937. He turned the title to Strange Fruit because it was a way of telling the story in a slightly different fashion. It evokes the idea of somebody looking at foreign objects hanging from trees and moving slightly closer to focus slightly more clearly on what they've witnessed, and then recoiling in horror at what the strange fruit hanging from the trees actually are. Mirapol was a communist teacher. In his spare time, he wrote songs and poems and plays, much of it very political stuff, and much of it really not having kind of an audience beyond his own immediate party circles. He devised a kind of a tune for Strange Fruit, and the song became part of a kind of like a fixture of leftist gatherings in 1938, and it was sung by Mirapol's wife initially. It became a hit initially for the black singer Laura Duncan at Madison Square Garden. And in the crowd that night was Robert Gordon, who had recently started to work at Cafe Society, and he had begun to manage Billie Holiday. The club that was the club at Cafe Society was established by a New Jersey shoe salesman called Barney Josephson, and it was directly meant to be a kind of a riposte to the elitism of Manhattan society. Billie Holiday was 23 by the time she got her job there. She'd been born in Philadelphia, and she had spent her early years working for a brothel in Baltimore, and she said that in her biography, Lady Sings the Blues, which is apparently in parts a work of fiction, that was the only time that she'd really seen white and black people kind of interact in a non-hostile manner or a non-dominating manner from white to black. She was the victim of sexual abuse when she was 10. Her neighbour tried to rape her, and she was sent to a Catholic reform school until she was released by her mother, obviously quite a wild child, and then drifted into prostitution later as a teenager. And she was jailed for this. And when she got out of prison, she began singing in the jazz clubs of Harlem, and she caught the eye of the producer John Hammond, and through him she became a star. When she went on stage, said Milt Gabler, the jazz impresario, in the spotlight she was absolutely regal. It was something, the way she held her head up high, the way she phrased each word, and got to the heart of the story in a song, and to the top of it, all she knew was where the beat was. When Mirapol played Josephson, Strange Fruit, Josephson said that he wanted to bring it to Billie Holiday. In her memoirs, Billie Holiday claims that she fell in love with the song right away, but she said, "Some guys brought me a hell of a damn song that I'm going to do," she told the band leader that night, Frankie Newton. But Mirapol remembered it slightly differently, believing that she'd performed it only as a favour to Josephson. To be perfectly frank, I don't think she felt comfortable with the song. Now, this is an interesting detail because as the song came to define Billie Holiday, it came to define a picture of Billie Holiday as this rather empowered and radical character, whereas initially that's perhaps not the case. Initially, perhaps she was as nervous about the political subtext of the song as anybody else. It wasn't really very common for people to stand up in jazz clubs and sing songs about brutal lynchings in the South. The reception to the song was either rapturous applause or anger. There was often shocked silence, with people walking out of the club in disgust, having wanted to be simply entertained. But by April the 20th, 1939, the song was recorded and by the record label Columbia. Billie Holiday left Cafe Society in 1939, but took the song with her. There was speculation that the song might be so politically explosive that it would actually inspire new lynchings in the South. But Billie Holiday herself guarded the song with fierce kind of intensity. She became very angry when the black folk singer Josh White, who joined Cafe Society in 1943, began to sing the song as well. She threatened him and was very, very indignant that her song, as she saw it, was being appropriated by somebody else. Josh White himself was somebody who was no kind of lightweight figure, having grown up in South Carolina and witnessed 2 lynchings by the age of 8 years old. His band in 1940, the Carolinians, had released the song Chain Gang, which was obviously a reference to the mass incarceration of black Americans and the forced labour extracted from them. And he was the victim of violence as a result of the song. When he took a break from singing and stood outside Cafe Society one night, 7 white servicemen set about him and gave him a beating. During one of his shows in Pennsylvania, someone shouted, "Yeah, that song was written by a nigger lover." And in 1947, just to kind of emphasise the relationship again with the song and the political left, Josh White spoke to the Daily Worker newspaper, and he said, "When I sing Strange Fruit, I feel as powerful as an M4 tank." Josh White became one of the most popular folk singers in America, and it was him, as well as Billie Holiday, that popularised the song. He particularly saw it as a political tool. In the early 1940s, Billie Holiday discovered heroin. Perhaps her childhood and the suffering in her life, the chaos in her upbringing, and her early experiences of sexual abuse and then prostitution meant that her addiction was a strong possibility for her at any time. But it would be heroin which would devour her in the end. And not only was it simply heroin, but also the experience now of being a very high-profile and famous black American woman in a white society, openly critiquing that society and holding up a mirror to it of its crimes. This was something that was very, very bold of her, but also ultimately destructive. She was called in 1944 a naval officer in a club she was singing in, called her a nigger, and she broke a bottle and tried to lunge at him with it, and was obviously restrained. Later on, whilst walking down 52nd Street, a friend called to her, "How are you doing, Lady Day?" And her reply was pretty succinct. "Well, I'm still a nigger," she said. The gradual decline in her well-being was exacerbated in 1947 when she served a year in prison for possession of heroin. When she came out, 10 days after she came out, she performed a comeback show at Carnegie Hall, where and this was a kind of like a metaphor for her situation, She was obviously intoxicated at the time, and she accidentally pierced her face with a hat pin, and went on stage with blood trickling down her face. And she sang "Strange Fruit" there, with kind of with a mixture of sweat and blood upon her, which is kind of, I guess, quite fitting, really. And the 1950s, her performances declined as she drifted further and further into addiction. And when she went on stage, she had sort of begun to lose her voice, and her delivery of "Strange Fruit" became less and less melodious, more and more kind of like an act of masochism. White racist audience members would walk out. It's interesting to question why white racists are going to see Billie Holiday in the first place, but there you have it. And she had at this point really lost the beauty of her youth and had been ravaged by the illness of heroin addiction. And she seemed to be at this point kind of like a signifier for this deeper tragedy of segregation and discrimination and racial violence. David Margolick, the music writer, said, "She'd grown oddly, sadly suited to capture the full grotesqueness of the song. Now she not only sang of bulging eyes and twisted mouths, she embodied them. It was a way in which the song had sort of overtaken her, really." She died in 1959 on the 17th of July at New York Hospital, after she'd recorded the "Strange Fruit" for the fourth time. And the song began after her death to sort of drift away from public consciousness. And interestingly, it never became a civil rights anthem. Instead, songs like "We Shall Overcome" became, and gospel music became the sound of the civil rights movement, initially in the 1950s, because they articulated a hope, a determination, a steadfastness, a vision for the future, not the darkness of "Strange Fruit." Though in subsequent decades, obviously, the song has returned to prominence as one of the great protest songs of the 20th century. Anyway, I'm going to look more in the near future at everyone from Woody Guthrie all the way through to the protest music that we experience in the 20th and late 20th and early 21st centuries. So do watch out for more of this kind of thing, because it's a fascinating cultural topic. Now, if you are wanting to find out about more and look at more explaining history content, check out our Patreon page. Obviously, we rely on the flimsy trickle of advertising revenue, but mainly on the donations and the kindness of strangers. So if you can help, that's all gratefully received. Thanks very much, and I'll catch you on the next podcast. Bye-bye.